Vera, thank you so much. Thanks to you and to our colleague Justin for all you did to get ready for this program. Welcome all of you to today's program on brain science for judges, featuring a spectacular book. And as a coincidence would have it, today is National Book Lovers Day. So yay you, you're observing as you should. Please forgive a quick and painless Berkeley Judicial Institute advertisement before we get started. Now that we have you here, we would love to have you back. Check out our website where you can see registration links for future programs, watch recordings of past programs, find interesting things to read, to watch. Consider joining our mailing list where you can be up to date on all of our programs. Follow us on social media. Advertisement over, and on to the reason you're really here today. I will so briefly introduce our extraordinary faculty. I believe that is with their forgiveness, because I promise we could spend all of our time talking about them. Our moderator is Professor Emily Murphy of UC Law San Francisco, whose research focuses on the intersection of neuroscience, behavioral science, and the law. She will be in conversation with all of the authors of Brain Science for Lawyers, Judges, and Policymakers. And they are Professor Owen Jones of Vanderbilt, Professor Jeffrey Schall of Vanderbilt, Professor Francis Shen of the University of Minnesota, Minnesota Law, retired trial judge, amateur neuroscientist, and novelist Morris Hoffman, and Professor Anthony Wagner of Stanford. So with that, let's get to it. Professor Murphy, where will we start today?
Thank you so much, Denise. It's always such a pleasure to have a judicial audience and especially to be in conversation with these colleagues who have put together such a fantastic resource, Brain Science for Lawyers, Judges, and Policymakers. I think it's always nice to figure out, and I'll start with Owen here, what motivated this project? Why did you folks put together this book?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Vera, Denise, and Emily for having us. We're happy to talk with you all. Stepping back sort of broadly, about 15 years ago, there was this sense that these great new neuroscientific technologies might help the law answer some of its perennial questions, things that had been around forever, like, is this person responsible for his or her behavior? Does this person have an accurate memory of some past events? Are they lying? Things like that. And so there was this sort of blossoming of hope that also was accompanied by lawyers zealously advocating for their clients, bringing neuroscience into the courtroom, and judges then having to deal with that both through evidentiary and other means. And so we had a sense, and the MacArthur Foundation was kind enough to fund us to create a research network on this, partnering lawyers and judges and neuroscientists. We had a sense that the legal system would need both a sense of where there might be promise in all this technology and also a clear sense of where there would be limitations. So we, in the research network, wound up co-designing and co-publishing about 100 research papers over a decade or so. And this book is really the pause we took at the end of that process to say, okay, what can we do to sort of summarize this and make this user-friendly? Obviously, we didn't go through all the experiments. What we wanted to do was provide judges with a very clear, very short, it's only a little over 100 pages, introduction to how the brain works, what its basic anatomy is, minimal jargon about neurons and that sort of thing, but enough of a sense that a legal thinker would know what was going on and could orient to the space. And so our idea was to give a sense of the technologies involved. So when you hear about fMRI or PET or EEG, you have some sense of what that is, and it's all very accessible. It's just sometimes takes a few minutes of introduction. And we would explain the technologies, the limitations, some of the legal connections, some of the places where neuroscience was unlikely to be able to help the legal system, and to do it all with sort of a glossary that could be really handy as a desk reference, and a lot of points to a curated set of further readings that could help people dig in a little bit more deeply on anything in particular. The final thing I'll say about what motivated this is we started getting lots of questions from judges, from lawyers, from prosecutors, and they often reflected sort of the same sense of, how do I get oriented to such a potentially complicated area without getting in over my head and down into the weeds? And so that's really what motivated our getting into this.
That segues nicely into questioning. Whenever we start a writing project, we have to think about the audience. And so, Jeff, the book says it's for lawyers, judges, and policymakers, and Owen just explained that's who it's for. You're a neuroscientist, though. Who is the book for, in the sense of what background do people need to understand the book, and how do you write for that particular audience?
Thank you for including me in this, Emily. It's good to see everybody. Let me answer the question, but first make a minor correction. I've moved from Vanderbilt University to York University in Toronto, but we still relate on this topic. Another origin story for this book is a course that Owen and I began teaching, and then Francis was part of it for several years, on law and neuroscience, where we brought together graduate students in the science and law students, and we met at the same place at the same time, so the registrar was not disturbed. And we learned how to bridge the language across these two groups. The book is intended for the practitioners. About, I'd say, 96% of modern neuroscience is not in the book. 95% of modern neuroscience is probably irrelevant for the law, but there's that 1 or 2%. What's hard to know is which 1 or 2% that is, which technique has value at this time. So I came into the MacArthur Project as a neuroscientist. As you say, I have an interest in extending the science into the social sphere a bit. And in the early days, many of us neuroscientists came in with a fair bit of hubris because we didn't understand the law. All I knew were lawyer jokes. And I've learned to appreciate the nuance and the care and the design of the law, and how it can be the case that my latest discovery may not really be useful, maybe not at this time. So it's designed to be accessible. We learned how to avoid words like action potential. A neuroscientist hears action potential and knows that's what a neuron does. A lawyer, I think, hears that and knows that's what people do. And so terms of art had to be resolved. And so with Morris's help and the others, we were able to create language that I think anybody can read and then learn more from the further readings.
That's really helpful, and it is meant to be accessible then to bridge that gap. But so then I'll turn to Francis and ask, there's other books on the shelf. There's lots of neuroscience textbooks. Why do we need this book? And Owen referred to this being a pause in the work of the network to try to synthesize this. So also, why now?
Well, let me take the first question first, and nice to see you, Professor Murphy. So the reason for this book is really what Jeff just said. There's too much out there. You could Google right now and find a gazillion intro to the brain and intro to neuroscience resources. But what we found happening is that our legal readers, judges, attorneys, other policymakers, they just get overwhelmed, and no one has time to go back and do coursework in neuroscience when you're trying to decide cases. So much of the work was keeping things out of the book and really winnowing it down. And I'm really proud of the fact that the stuff in there is, we think the stuff that judges need. And of course, links to go and find more if it was needed for a particular case or of interest area. So I think that's the reason for this book in particular is you don't have to do, if you're a judge or a lawyer, all that figuring out of what actually matters. And we really try to use language and examples, real world examples that lawyers and judges would understand. The why now question, I'll pick up where Owen left off, is there's just a ton of demand for this area. It's still a niche area, you know. You ask the general public, people haven't heard of neurolaw, but it's really growing. And we see that in student interest. We see it in a lot of the judicial education programming that I run. I had the last thing I'll say is the great opportunity to work with Owen and everyone else in the MacArthur Research Network, and I co-directed our education and outreach programming. And so I was kind of at the front lines of working with judges, and have now been in the front of the room of, you know, thousands of judges over the last decade. And I would come to the end of these programs and say, okay, where do I go for more? And never been able to give them, just like one book. And now we can, and we're really excited about that.
It makes sense. And you start each chapter with a vignette, some of which even surprised me. And I work in this area of how frequently in the variety of contexts that neuroscience is showing up in courtrooms in subtle and also sort of hit you over the head ways. But it's still a science book at core. And I want to ask Morris Hoffman here. Didn't most, they sort of obligatory joke, I teach law students, I try to teach them science, and there's a sort of, oh, this is not why I went to law school. A lot of judges I know will say, I didn't, last science class I had was in high school. So why should lawyers and judges learn science? And in many ways, isn't it for the experts? How much do they need to know? Why should they start to learn it? And speaking from your position as a judge, like how much science and why?
Well, I think the reason judges in particular need to know this is the same reason judges need to know arithmetic if they're presiding over a case about accounting. I mean, sure, I could imagine a judge who didn't know anything about arithmetic, who didn't know what addition was, or subtraction, or multiplication, or division, and who could still preside over an accounting case, because we could have the expert teach the judge what addition and subtraction and multiplication and division were, but that would take an enormous amount of time. It would be inefficient. And more importantly, it would fog the focus of where the hearing should be. This hearing should be about accounting, not about arithmetic. And I've experienced this myself after being in the network for a few years and learning as an amateur, learning some neuroscience. You know, I've had Daubert hearings on neuroscientific evidence, and I've been able to interrupt counsel and say, look, you don't have to spend an hour and a half teaching me about what a bold signal is. I know that. You don't have to spend another hour teaching me how fMRI measures bold signals. That's a waste of time. And more than that, it's diverting us from the real question and the real difficult question, which is, what does all this mean as a legal matter? And the way I sometimes teach my students about this, because it comes up also in my law and neuroscience classes, I use an example that Owen Jones taught me. I was at a lecture once and Owen was presenting, and he put up an image, an X-ray image of a human brain. And even though nobody in the audience was a radiologist, we could all detect the defect in this brain. It was a giant arrow stuck in the middle of this patient's brain. And so imagine a Daubert hearing that spent 90% of the time trying to educate the judge about what an X-ray is. We know what an X-ray is. We know they're reliable. We know that this X-ray actually showed, maybe with some spatial limitations questions, where this arrow was in the brain. That's not the question, that's the hard question. The hard question is, so what? What does this defendant having an arrow in his brain mean in terms of him or her not being able to form an intention, or not being competent, or being insane? And those are the really, really hard questions. So I think the answer is it will make us better decision makers, and it will make us more efficient decision makers to know something about the underlying science.
Makes sense. You the group has alluded to here that a lot had to be left out, but let's ask Anthony to tell us kind of what's the outline, like what stayed in, what are the key contents and why were those particular contents of each chapter chosen? Oh, fantastic. Look at that. Anthony, as another neuroscientist, do you want to walk us through like what kinds of things are in each chapter and why they stayed in?
Of course. So I'm assuming you can see the outline based on your response. Good to see you, Emily, and everybody. Thanks for joining us. So I'll very quickly kind of walk through what's in the book, which again, we hope through reading, maybe you can be in the position where Morris just described himself feeling empowered in terms of knowing maybe what aspects of the neuroscience evidence to focus on and what aspects perhaps are not relevant. So here's the table of contents of the 10 chapters. The first chapter, we begin with a survey of the kinds of litigation, legislation, and regulation where neuroscience is currently already being used. Then in chapters 2 through 8, we kind of turn to this high-level overview of sort of the brain and modern neuroscience methods. So in chapter 2, we do a high-level overview of the brain, including its place in the nervous system, taking up some of the gross anatomical features, the various bumps and folds of the brain, for example, terminology describing brain areas, which one will encounter, and being familiar with terminology is often sort of helpful, both for consuming the rest of the book, but also then in the applied setting. This terminology might include sort of directional terminology to help you understand, that's used to help us understand where we are in the brain or where a particular brain structure is sitting in relation to some other structure or anatomical landmark. Then in chapters 3 and 4, we have a 2-chapter overview of brain structure. It starts with gross or non-microscopic level of organization of the cerebral cortex. This is sort of the outer layer of the brain. This high-level review includes a review of the 4 lobes of the brain and some of the functions associated both with each of the lobes, but also particular brain regions within particular lobes. We then consider in chapter 4 the collection of neural structures in the inner or the deeper parts of the brain beneath the cerebral cortex. This includes structures that many on this Zoom might have encountered, at least in passing, structures such as the hippocampus, which is important for memory, the amygdala, whose function includes aspects of emotional processing, the basal ganglion striatum, which is important for movement and the formation of skills and habits, amongst other functions. In both of these chapters, we consider how aspects of cognition, be it memory, perception, language, habits, they emerge in part from the function of particular brain regions. But we also stress that the function of a particular brain region, often has many functions, and the particular function a region might play really heavily rests on what other brain regions and networks that structure is interacting with. And so there's not a one-to-one mapping between brain structure and function, and that's an important thing that we hope comes across from the book. Chapter 5 then kind of drills down a little bit more microscopic to the level of the neuron, covers the components of neurons and how neurons work. This includes covering how neurons communicate with each other, but at an accessible level. And we introduce some of the main transmitters in the brain, such as dopamine, serotonin, et cetera, that enable communication between neurons. In chapters 6 and 7, we turn to technologies that allow us to sort of look at the brain, look either at the brain's anatomy, its structure, or look at the brain's function. In chapter 6, we review imaging methods that reveal brain structure, anatomical imaging. This includes X-rays, computer axial tomography, or CAT or CT scans, structural MRI, structural magnetic resonance imaging, and related uses of MRI, such as ways of visualizing the anatomical wiring, the cables that connect up different parts of the brain through things like diffusion tensor imaging. In chapter 7, we turn to the various modern functional imaging methods. These are methods that allow us to measure some aspect of neural activity or neural response. This includes electroencephalography, EEG, magnetoencephalography, MEG, positron emission tomography, PET, as well as functional MRI. And each of these imaging methods picks up on different signals from the brain. They vary in how precisely they can measure where the signal is coming from, as well as how precisely they can measure when the neural response is actually happening, and understanding those strengths and weaknesses of these different kinds of methods is important for understanding the relevance of the data in any given context. We also cover forms of PET that also reveal kind of structural aspects of the brain, such as the ways in which you can use PET to measure the density of particular types of receptors, or a very common use of PET to measure the density or the burden of particular molecules in the brain, such as the burden of the proteins that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. Then in chapter 8, we turn to other sort of neuroscience methods that are not used just to record, characterize the structure of the brain or the function of the brain, but they're methods that allow us to sort of manipulate the workings of the brain, the function of the brain. These include methods such as deep brain stimulation, where their electrodes are implanted deep in the brain for a particular reason, and this can inhibit or activate particular brain systems. Along with 2 stimulation methods where you can stimulate at the scalp, either using magnetic pulses or electrical pulses to either activate or inhibit brain function. And then finally, in chapters 9 and 10, we scale back out. Chapter 9, I think we probably collectively view as a very significant chapter in terms of applied relevance. We take up some of the limitations and the cautions that we think are warranted for the various methods. This includes issues about, the spatial or temporal resolution, how precise a given method is. It also includes sort of highlighting what one is looking at when you're looking at, say, maps of brain activity. Where did those maps come from? What are the statistical and analytic sort of methods at a high level that are applied to generate these images that might then be entered in a legal setting? And what are some of the limitations? What should we be thinking about and understanding about those kinds of data, those kinds of maps? And then finally, in chapter 10, I don't know if we go rogue, but we speculate about the future after following these sort of cautionary sort of words. We also then speculate about what are some legal questions with additional neuroscience breakthroughs. What are some legal questions where we think there's some chance that neuroscience will have something to say, such as diagnosing chronic pain, diagnosing perhaps some psychiatric conditions, assessing or detecting or reading out legally relevant states of mind, issues of lie detection, memory detection. So that in a nutshell is sort of the book.
And covering all that in just over 100 pages, including further readings and resources, which are annotated references for deeper reading, as Owen referred to before. But Owen started here saying, we had to leave a lot out. And I think that probably people come to an education event like this with some questions about brain science and its relationship to law and policy. So I would be interested to hear what is something that you had to leave out that is kind of a favorite area. And this is an open question to the entire group of authors. What's something that you find interesting and important in neuro law, but that just isn't and can't be covered in a book like this, but is something that is near and dear to you?
I'll jump in. Oh, sorry, Owen, go ahead.
No, please, Jeff, go ahead.
So I'm a neuroscientist. I do studies listening to the activity, the signals produced by single neurons. And I've had the experience of listening to the signal of a neuron and being able to predict into the near future, like maybe 1 second, what the owner of that neuron was going to do. Or I could listen to another neuron and know that the owner of that neuron said, oops, I made a mistake. So where I live scientifically, in the right experimental conditions, we can find strong associations between particular brain cell activity, particular circuits, and behavior, actions, reflections, memories, and so on. We don't talk about that much because it isn't that practically relevant, but I want to convey to the group that neuroscience research is on the edge of amazing discoveries that can be relevant. So I want to advocate for more neuroscience in this sphere.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Owen.
Okay, just following up on what Jeff said about some of the exciting things that we didn't get a chance to include within the book, things that make us really sit up and take notice, even if they're not immediately legally relevant, are some of the experiments that that these colleagues and our broader team did. I'll just give a couple examples. Anthony led a study out at Stanford that he might want to talk about more if asked. In which he demonstrated, he and his team, that it was possible under laboratory conditions, carefully controlled, to detect autobiographical memories in the form of essentially a neural biomarker of recognizing a place from an image, a place that that person individually had been. That's not ready for prime time. That's not something that's going to come to the court anytime soon, but it does give a remarkable taste of how exquisitely exploratory this neuroscience is and some of the things it's capable of. I'll just give a couple other quick examples. We had a group studying how people in the position of judges and jurors make punishment decisions. They would read, while their brains were being scanned, short scenarios involving a crime. There was clues about mental state, information about the harm, and then the person would have to make a decision how much to punish that individual, hypothetically. And we were able, across a series of experiments, not only to tease out different areas of the brain that were used in different tasks, like assessing the mental state of the protagonist and assessing the harm that the protagonist caused, and then figuring out how to integrate those two pieces of information and choose a punishment. But we were able to basically see one each area of the brain tamping down another if, for example, the harm was very high, but the culpable mental state was very, very low. Say a protagonist was hearing demons and otherwise insane. We were also able, to Jeff's point about how amazing the neuroscience is, in another experiment, we were able to temporarily deactivate one area of the brain that we thought was involved in this this decision circuit, and thereby change, as we had predicted, how much someone punished a protagonist without changing at all how much they blamed the protagonist. That was really a very interesting dissociation, suggesting we were really getting at some of the causal things involved. The final experiment I'll mention is one where we tested for the first time one of the assumptions underlying the model penal code's distinction between knowing mental states and reckless mental states. People get punished very, very differently for the same act, depending upon which of these two mental states they are in. These mental states were the invention of legal philosopher kings, just saying it seems like people have these different mental states. We tested out whether that was true. And using a combination of fMRI and machine learning algorithms, we were able to demonstrate that under some laboratory conditions, this combination of technologies could identify a distinction between when someone was in a reckless frame of mind and they were in, as the law defines it, a knowing frame of mind. That's just a taste of a lot of different experiments that our team and some other teams have done as well. And we just didn't have room in the book for all of that sort of whiz bang, oh, wow, look at this cool stuff that's been discovered publications. But people should know it's out there, as Jeff was saying, and Morris.
I just wanted to say that your question, Emily, it's really interesting, has triggered the same debate amongst us that we had while we were writing this book. And the debate is, and my role was always to throw a little bit of cold water on things, which I am going to do now, but just a little bit. We have a MacArthur colleague named Stephen Morse who's coined a term called the what does he call it? The brain overclaim syndrome. And it's meant to describe the fact that in our courtrooms every day, lawyers are trying to make neuroscience do things it cannot do. And we tried very hard in the book to sort of hit the sweet spot between being too cynical about what's happening in most of our courtrooms in terms of lawyers misusing the neuroscience, and being too excited about neuroscience. And I hope we did hit that sweet spot. I think Owen mentioned this in a little bit. It's important for everyone to understand. This gives you a sense of how far neuroscience is and how far it isn't. What we mentioned in the book, that neuroscience has learned more about the human brain in the last 30 years than has been discovered in all of previous human history. That's amazing. But what happens is sometimes people conflate the speed of that learning with the distance that's been traveled. And I think people say, oh, we've learned so fast by now, 30 years after some of these neuroimaging techniques had been invented, we must pretty much know everything about the brain. And I will defer to my neuroscience colleagues, but I bet that if you were forced to pick between two sentences, we know everything about the brain, or we know nothing about the brain, which of those two is most accurate? I know, first of all, you'll reject the premise, but I'm the judge, so I can force you to accept this premise. If you accept the premise, which of those is true? I bet you'll say, we know nothing about the brain. So anyway, this was the debate that we had. It was a wonderful debate, and I hope the book sort of reflects in a neutral kind of way that we were trying to thread this needle.
Francis, Anthony, anything that you love about neurolaw that couldn't make it in?
Well, my pet topic, which will come as no surprise to you, Emily, brain-based lie detection isn't ready for the courtroom and didn't deserve extensive coverage in the book. But of course, it's one of my favorite topics. You know, the other thing that was challenging is we couldn't go in depth on, any one particular type of brain issue. For example, dementia. We could have had, and there are multiple long books about dementia. So it wasn't our place here, or sports concussions. It wasn't our place to go really in depth. This is the foundation that would be useful for all of those. As a law profession, again, you like this. We also tried not to go down the wormhole of evidentiary admissibility, because again, that would have been
That's my thing.
right, exactly, and that's another book. And also those are judicial decisions. It's not for us to decide, and there are other places to comment on it. So we really tried to make this foundational and useful for all of those issues, as Judge Hoffman said at the beginning, so that you can get to the core of admissibility discussions, but you might come to that with some basic understanding of, oh, that's what that technology is, or that's kind of roughly how this organ works.
Before I let Anthony answer, Francis, that's a teaser. I think people are wondering, can brain scans detect lies?
Anthony and I just spoke for an hour about this last week. I'm writing a book on it. I'll let Anthony answer. He's done the meta review on this. Perfect segue, Dr. Wagner.
That was great. The answer is going to be very unsatisfying. So as part of the network and in collaboration with a number of members of the network, my lab, we study how people learn and remember, and we look at these sort of brain patterns related to learning and remembering, including memory states that, like Owen referred to. A lot of the sort of fMRI lie detection literature, a lot of it is about memory detection, the detection of concealed information. That said, the literature is kind of fraught with, kind of like the polygraph literature, it's fraught with real experimental design constraints and other sort of assumptions that underlie the inferences that are being drawn. And when we did a careful review of this literature, first in 2010, and then in a published paper in 2014 in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, the conclusion, kind of unsatisfying, is we don't know, right? The literature is not sufficient to really draw any clear conclusions. The studies are limited, insufficient in major ways. And one, in part, because it's just an inherently hard problem to work on. You can't have people lying about real world things in an instructed manner with real possible outcomes, like in an experiment, right? Like people face in the real world, where there are major consequences if they are caught lying, right, for them. So it's just hard to do. But so we concluded that, well, the literature is insufficient to warrant the conclusion that, in fact, fMRI can detect, that neuroscience can detect whether somebody's lying or not. And hope, perhaps in the coming decades, there will be progress on some of the limitations and limited problems in that literature. And I'll be very brief, since I just sort of weighed in here about fMRI lie detection. For me, one thing that's been exciting about neuroscience is neuroscience, like a lot of sciences, we make progress through technical discoveries, often not even in our own field. And so discoveries on the medical imaging front that then get applied to fMRI. And suddenly we're able to do, Jeff was talking about recording from individual neurons and being able to make predictions about action a second or two later. And with fMRI and modern human neuroscience tools, you can record from populations of neurons, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds, millions of neurons, and you can read those brain patterns into AI-like analytic techniques. And this is what we did to read out memory states, see if we can detect whether somebody's remembering or not. And you can say something about their thought, whether they're likely to remember or not if you're doing this at learning, or whether they're having the experience of remembering or not. And so we've kind of been there now for about 15, maybe going on about 20 years, feeding neuroscience data into AI systems. But with the advent of sort of these large language models, these other sort of modern day AI tools, there's just this explosion of, and we're on the cusp of, I think, this next wave of discovery in the neurosciences, and perhaps then with with implications for real world applications, where it's not just that we're using AI to read out something about brain states, we're then actually using the knowledge that's been acquired by large language models to make further interpretations of what somebody may or may not be thinking or knowing or understand from their brain states. And so we're in this kind of new bidirectional cycle between cutting edge modern day AI and current state of the neuroscience world. And I think, one, it's premature to have included that in the book, but I suspect if we wrote the book 10 or 15 years from now, there may well be major discoveries that will come from that.
Perfect for updated versions. There's a lot of hedging going on in sort of both what we know about neuroscience and what can be learned in a primer like this or something. But what should, I think you've all alluded to, that it's really important that we collectively sort of keep this hedging and keep our cautions and keep our skepticism up. But what should legal folks be particularly cautious of, or maybe attuned to, when looking at a brain science study, when thinking about this book, and thinking about how it applies in their sphere or to a problem that they're facing? What are the big limitations and cautions that each of you think is important?
Well, I will start with, if I may, with the reverse inference problem. So the problem, one of the problems with studying the brain isn't just that it's unimaginably complicated, but that pretty much all of it is working at all times. And so when neuroscientists try to tweak out what functions, what structures are related to what functions, it's very difficult. And so what they're looking at is in fMRI, for example, is in task-based fMRI is differential activation. Since the brain's working at all times, all parts of the brain, what parts of the brain are working more or less during this task? And piecing all of these things together starts to build a model of what brain regions might be associated with what the brain is doing and what the owner of the brain is doing. But the problem is, with just that kind of information and nothing more, you can't tell whether this region of increased activation is increase because that's the region that's doing the work. So that you can't tell whether the causational arrow is in that direction or whether this is just an exhaust fume of what other area of the brain is doing the work. And neuroscientists call this the reverse inference problem, and the media make this mistake all the time. So every other week you'll read a media report about neuroscientists discover the music center or the fear center, or as if this part of the brain does that function. And as one of you mentioned earlier, this correlation is not only not one-to-one, the direction of the correlation is not always understood. And that's the challenge. That's the central legal challenge, right? It is that whatever that arrowhead is doing in the middle of that guy's brain, what's it doing to that guy's function? It's very difficult to get data about that.
Thanks, Morris. I'll chime in with another example. I'm sure others will think of some as well. One thing that our audience might be really interested to know and remember is that contextually, because lawyers know that a picture is worth 1,000 words, they may sometimes want to introduce an image from, say, fMRI, and treat it as if it somehow is meaningfully like an X-ray. That is, it's showing something that's actually there in a way that's analogous. And probably the most important thing that the audience should remember is that there's no inherent meaning to any of the colors on these fMRI images. The colors are defined in the paper specific or in the clinical study, and they're all thresholded at different levels of statistical difference between, as Morris was mentioning, different conditions that the subject is encountering. And so therefore, it's often referred to, the jargon is a statistical parametric map, but you don't want to just look at this and say, this part of the brain is yellow and this part of the brain is red, and therefore conclude that something automatically follows. And I think that's something that our book walks people through in a very accessible way and helps them distinguish between what a lawyer may be quite genuinely believing to be true about an image that he or she is presenting and what is actually neuroscientifically true. So I think that's one key lesson that people need to remember.
So the judges here might take away that the construction of images is as much art as science, that there isn't like a standardized choice of like when brain regions are colored yellow, that these are choices done by experimenters and clinicians and whoever is constructing that image.
Absolutely. And then those are overlaid typically on top of a structural image sort of in the background. So it's one thing on top of another rather than a revealing of what's actually in there, as if somehow these are the only areas of the brain that are relevant or the only areas of the brain that are active.
And what our brains actually look like inside our skulls is probably just dark. And even when they're churning really hard, right? There's no, okay, got it. We have a great question from the audience that I made me think of my own answer as well, but I want to hear from you folks. I'm wondering if anyone has a particular case in mind for the greatest misuse of neuroscience. And I could see breaking that question down a number of different ways, like greatest in terms of the consequence, probably removing someone's freedom, right? Greatest in terms of most offensive to the science itself. I'll leave it to various interpretations, but what is the thing that if you were to say, oh man, someone's going to read this book and feel empowered to go forth with wielding a tool that they don't fully understand or that they might misuse, what is the greatest misuse of neuroscience?
Does someone want to tell the story of Grady Nelson? Is that a good one?
That is a good one.
Am I going to tell it?
think it's you. You're the kid who put his hand up in the classroom, right?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and get us started, Jeff?
Yeah. So he is a fellow in Florida, committed a nasty murder, and it was capital offense, and he was going to be sentenced to death. And then his brain was scanned in a particular way, and the brain scan came back and was presented in the sentencing phase to the jury, and it swayed them so that he has life in prison instead of the death penalty, because enough of them thought something was wrong with his brain, so he's not that guilty.
Yes, that was an
That's
unusual case because the jurors actually spoke to the media afterward and said that in one juror's case, it turned his decision completely around. Now, I don't think as a panel, and I don't mean to put words in Jeff's mouth, but I don't think we're intending to take a position on whether or not fundamentally there was something wrong with his brain. It's just the evidence as it was presented was not as compelling as the jurors seemed to take it, was sort of the assessment from the outside. There was another case in response to the audience question that I was trying to remember the name of. Is it the Harrington case where the P300 wave was introduced? I see a couple of you nodding.
Yeah.
So hopefully
Terry
I got the name.
Harrington, Iowa.
Yes, right. So my recollection is that someone did a study of the defendant in an alleged sort of lie detection context, looking for a particular signal in the brain, and was asking questions like tall grass, and seeing how the person's brain would react, given that apparently there was very tall grass that whoever actually committed the crime had to pass through in order to get from one part of the crime scene to another. And my recollection of the case, which is not crisp at the moment, is that we thought this was not a very rigorous way of investigating the brain activity.
This is not, for me as a memory scientist, this isn't a case that occurred in the US, but around the time that the MacArthur Network was coming to be in 2008, there was a case that came to the world's attention in the state of Mumbai, India, where state forensics lab was using some form of EEG recordings at the scalp to detect whether or not a suspect, an individual, has guilty knowledge for related to the crime. And an individual was, D.T. Sharma, was initially convicted of murder from the brain evidence. It's pretty clear from the magistrate's transcript and the reasoning behind the decision, as those brain data were very persuasive, and the expert testimony about the brain data were very persuasive. And there were very specific claims being made about the brain data signaling that there's one could only end up with these sort of brain patterns, not from encountering information about the case in other settings, but it had to be from being present and part of the experience. And that, of course, there was kind of a call to the neuroscience community and to begin to sort of conduct the kind of science that the network supported, and to sort of really weigh in on and assess what are the capabilities of modern day neuroscience tools, and also then to be able to begin to get out of our labs and weigh in as experts in terms of expert testimony, et cetera, about both the strengths and limitations of the kinds of data that might show up in the courts. And I've only done that once in sort of a pretrial hearing about fMRI lie detection as whether it's suitable. And this goes back to the prior discussion about sort of cautions and things we maybe sort of legal actors might want to know. When I sort of read the evidence that was being provided from the forensic lab that did the fMRI lie detection assessment, It was very striking as a scientist to see tens and tens of studies cited as documenting the sensitivity, the specificity of fMRI lie detection. And having recently reviewed that literature, knowing that nearly all of those papers were actually just simple group-based studies, whereas the situation in front of the court was, can we detect whether or not an individual in response to individual questions is or is not lying? And so one thing that was just striking to me is the lack of relevance of a lot of the evidence that was being proffered as documenting the scientific record for a particular method. I don't know if that was helpful.
Brings a number of things I want to put a pin in. One is the group to individual inference issue. Another is something judges encounter all the time, which is experts from academia with perhaps a disinterest in the case versus experts who are selling their services to advocates. But what Anthony was just talking about relates directly to another question from another audience member that says, I have difficulty conceiving how a methodology could be devised to develop a controlled experiment testing the use of neuroscience for lie detection. Is that feasible? And I want to applaud our audience member for thinking about experimental design, because that is a huge issue for understanding how something is relevant. So is there a quick answer to that?
Well, I could get us started, and Anthony or Jeff can revise and supplement from there. Shout out to our colleague Josh Green up at Harvard, who did a study, to my knowledge, the first that really tried to get beyond the problem of just experimenters playing a game of poker with the subjects. Most of the lie detection models, experimental models, were try to deceive us and we'll try to get past your deception. What Josh did is he actually legitimately deceived people, sending them into the magnet under the understanding that they would see a video of a coin flip, and he was going to try to study their brain while they were trying to predict the future. Not surprisingly, their output would be heads or tails before the coin ended its flip. And not surprisingly, for the first half of the experiment, everyone was hovering around chance in terms of their accuracy predicting the future. His innovation was to add a second half of the experiment where he told the subjects that their head was moving when they were moving their fingertips to predict in advance. And so would they from now on just silently to themselves make the prediction, and once the coin had landed, just say yes or no, whether they were accurate. The important part is to understand that they got more money the more accurate they were, and they knew that throughout the experiment, that they would leave with more money. So now you had people who could lie, and some of whom were incentivized to lie, and roughly half the subjects we statistically know did lie, because suddenly you had people up around 75 to 90% accurate in their ability to predict the future, miraculously. Who knew? And to our surprise, collectively as a group, Josh's study showed that if you analyze the brain data of the people who had been lying at some point and the people who were hovering near chance, you could pretty cleanly dissociate these two groups. The reason that's not legally relevant right now is that you had no way of knowing on which question they were lying. You were just really, drilling down on this statistical coin flip and being able to detect some differential brain activity there. But Jeff or Anthony, do you want to add or supplement that?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, thanks, Anthony. So another point I'd make involves the nature of the measurement of brain function. So the study we just heard about used fMRI. We've heard about EEG. These are indirect measures of brain function. But the brain works by individual neurons and circuits of neurons interacting with each other. It's kind of like, I think, a jury trial. So you got the courtroom, the judge, the jury, the attorneys, the audience or the others in the courtroom. And it's the communication and the influences through the voices, through the speaking, that make the difference. Now, maybe I don't have access to that. I could imagine a situation where I have acoustic monitors and I can measure heat and humidity. Voices create sound and they create heat and humidity. So through indirect measures, I could figure out where the jury sits because they never talk. And I could figure out whether it was a really animated case and the audience is oohing and awing. But I couldn't know what the case was about from these indirect measures. And this is one way to think about the use of functional brain imaging and EEG as a measure.
Maybe I'll be brief, but one thing again, put on my lens as a learning and memory scientist. One thing that I often think about as a significant constraint, and this not just applies to the fMRI-based lie detection literature, but it's also been sort of an issue for the polygraph for decades. A lot of the experimental work, including the wonderful study, very clever and very compelling study by Josh Green and colleagues, that's happening in the labs, there's some relationship to the real world setting where we may be interested off of neural data in determining whether or not they're lying. But there's often, and probably normatively in most cases, there are major differences. The stakes of being caught, if it was detected that you were lying for you in a sort of lab-based sort of game, well, you might lose a little bit of money or something along those lines, but it's not like you would be incarcerated or there'd be other sort of possible penalties. As a learning and memory scientist, often when somebody's, brain is being assessed, these neural patterns, it's not the first time they're thinking about their response to the critical question. In fact, in the fMRI lie detection sort of case that I was an expert witness in, this was regarding an accusation of murder that had occurred years ago, that had already gone through trial, that the accused clearly had many, many, many memories over. And these sort of our experiences lay down and change, new memories, they change the brain patterns that are going to be evoked. And that undoubtedly is going to be the case also with respect to lying. Having thought about what your response might be before you're in that moment where the neural data are being used to assess whether or not you're telling the truth or not, that's likely a very different state in terms of the underlying neural signals from that very initial moment and where you're being asked for the first time to respond and you have the opportunity to lie or not.
I wanted to ask all of you if there's something that judges could take away about how to evaluate experts and how to neuroscience experts and how to evaluate the information they're offering, sort of a framework to have about key questions about how to think about them or how not to think about them. And the related question is that any different than any other type of expert evidence?
To answer your last question first, I don't think qualitatively it's different really than any other expert in terms of how we judge things. It can be more complicated, and we spend a lot of time in the book talking about assumptions that good neuroscientists make, and that good neuroscientists are willing to admit our assumptions, and the limitations, spatial, temporal, other limitations on neuroimaging techniques that good neuroscientists are willing to admit to. And I suppose one way to put all that together in terms of your question is to say, if you have an expert on the stand who won't admit to those limitations, who won't recognize that this data is the product of a series of different kinds of assumptions about threshold, assumptions about all kinds of methodologies, then you probably have a bad expert.
That's really helpful. We have another really interesting question that's moving us a little bit away from the context of adjudication and more towards structural issues. How do we apply brain science knowledge to develop better criminal responses to trauma, substance use disorders, mental illness, criminogenic thinking? Are there lessons that would cause us to run jails differently or supervise offenders differently? Is this something that I know this is something you've all thought about to varying degrees. Would anyone like to weigh in and maybe talk about how it relates to the future of law and neuroscience more generally?
Yeah, I could say a word about this. It's a great question, and those are exactly the issues that we typically focus on in our judicial training and education programs. We just completed a really neat program. It was a year long with Massachusetts state judges. It was co-created with the Flassner Institute with support from Dana Foundation. And we hit on every one of those topics, and the concrete suggestions were thinking about ways that neuroscience might inform daily practice. And I'll give one concrete example, which has to do with addiction and substance use disorder. Multiple of our experts talked about the different types of withdrawal and the different types of addiction. And we were able to use group level data to provide really clear guidance for, like, it doesn't matter who the individual is. If they're in this bucket, and here are the types of experts that will help you figure out if they're in this bucket, don't do this because they might die in the holding cell. Those are really concrete examples that we know now. And there are other examples that are a little hazier about exactly how the policy implications work out, but connecting, say, with mental health professionals around opioid use and addiction. So I think those are really important. What I'd say is the connection to this book is that all of those presentations at these judicial trainings, like the first set of slides are like, let's get up to speed on why it is that someone in withdrawal is having these issues. And that goes back to the sorts of, basic science that we cover in the book. But yeah, the answer is those discussions are really concrete. It's what I think most judges and lawyers want to know. But to get there, there's got to be at least a little on-ramp. And I think this book is part of that on-ramp.
Actually, Francis, your answer brings us back to something that we're putting a pin in, which has been alluded to in a couple of different conversations, which is this group-based data, group-based inferences, data over time, data in large groups, behavior over time versus an individual or a point in time, and making the link between group-based and individual. Group-based maybe is more structural. You can develop policies based on group-based data, but individual is what's happening in the courtroom or in a particular parole or supervised release context. So how does anyone in the panel want to talk about this group to individual inference challenge and how judges and lawyers and policymakers should be thinking about it?
I'll start. I remember reading a paper, and you all probably know exactly which one it is, but it was about this problem. In fact, one of our MacArthur subgroups was devoted to this issue of this problem of group to individual. Science largely, and particularly neuroscience largely, is a group-based effort. And I remember this paper, and you'll see this in almost every neuroimaging paper. There'll be a set of images. These are not from one subject. They might be from 50 subjects, and they're an average of the data taken from 50 subjects. And in this particular paper, there was a small number of subjects. I think there were 15. And on the left-hand side, they showed the average image from those 15. And on the right-hand side, they showed the actual images from those 15. And none of the 15 looked anything like the average. It was really quite striking. And of course, law generally cares about individual issues. The law cares about whether this defendant is competent or whether this defendant was capable of forming the required intention, and not about group data. So it's a real problem. There are areas of the law that sort of pay more attention, or what's the way to put it, are more relatable to group data. Issues about epidemiology, for example, in products liability cases, those sorts of things. But even there, the question in the end becomes, did this plaintiff get cancer from this product? Not do most plaintiffs, not do 70% of plaintiffs. And these probabilistic inquiries are a real challenge for the law. I guess that's all I'll say about it.
We do have another question that is quite specific about sort of kind of current literature, which is, are any recent developments on the relationship between amygdala activity and implicit bias? And I might toss this to one of our neuroscientists first to explain what both of those things are and what the generalized relationship between them has been. And I have not done the literature search. Great. Anthony has Anthony did the literature search while we were waiting. Fantastic, please.
Yes, so I can't tell you too much about what it says. Just a quick, it's not an area I work in, just a quick look in the literature. It's clear that there continues to be some work on this issue about sort of these sort of non-conscious implicit biases that we all have through our life experience in the worlds that we occupy, the cultures that we're part of. And as the question is noting, there's some initial suggestion or observation suggesting that the magnitude of implicit, race-based implicit biases in individuals in terms of their behavioral expression on a behavioral task, assessing implicit bias, was correlated with the strength of activation in the amygdala when seeing out-group versus in-group faces. And it looks like there are still, there continues to be a bit of work in that area. I don't have a sense. One thing that's occurred over the past maybe decade since some of this earlier work has come out in the literature is an appreciation that sample sizes really matter in terms of being able to detect clear, robust relationships between behavioral effects and neural effects. We've kind of, we should know that in terms of just data and statistics and whatnot. A number of, including from my own lab, and so I'm not suggesting it's just this literature, but a number of observations in the first decade or decade and a half of the functional imaging literature, because it was such a young literature, a new literature, just being able to get sample sizes on the order of like a few tens of participants was a real success and real progress. A lot of that early literature is fraught by underpowered studies that might lead to, observed correlations that might not be as robust as one goes to power, goes to full scale in terms of sample, but also a selectivity, a missing of a lot of the other neural correlates of implicit bias above and beyond, say, a particular brain region, such as the amygdala. And so I don't know whether the current state of the literature in this particular subspace is now at the order of 100, 200 participants, but that kind of is where we need to be pretty confident in these relationships. I don't know, Jeff, if you want to, I'm not trying to undermine this literature. I don't know the current state of it. Jeff, I'm not sure if you want to say anything else.
This is so far from my expertise. I have nothing to offer beyond that.
But it does give us another chance to, and another example of the reverse inference fallacy. So Anthony,
Yes.
hypothetically, would you ever look at amygdala activity and be able to say, oh, this person's amygdala shows this amount of activity, therefore they have a certain amount or degree of bias?
Right. No, you cannot do that. And that obviously it's, there's countless, unfortunately, studies, not saying this implicit bias study, which was the early study, the initial study by Liz Phelps and colleagues was an outstanding study, very well controlled, but there's a lot of sort of kind of pop neuroscience studies. You're in love with your iPhone because you see your iPhone versus some other some other device, and well, you get this, activation in regions of the brain associated with positive affect or something along that. There's many studies that do this reverse inference, and one cannot simply look at sort of in an individual brain or in a group of brains, activation or particular brain region and know with high level of confidence what their psychological state is.
I want to think a little bit more about the future. Oh, well, we have one other excellent question. We'll take a look at that. I do want to ask, as we're thinking about the future, both of neuroscience and of legal practice, are there things you would start as the world gets inherently more complex and more technological and we get better to access via technology to our own biology, and some of the hard problems are coming down to our biology and massive amounts of data? Are there ways you would change legal education or lawyer training or judicial training? I think about this a lot as a law professor. Are there things you would make prerequisites as part of legal education? And then we'll go back to our audience question.
I used to joke that I would, as part of selection process, give every candidate a psychiatric exam. But beyond that,
just scan their brain now? No. Just kidding.
Actually, Francis has written, and I've commented on one of his papers. This is slightly off topic, but about the problem of aging judges and whether we should, when judges first get appointed, whether they should take some baseline measurements about cognitive abilities so that at least they, even if we don't have any regulatory apparatus that ever has access to this, at least they will know the extent to which their cognition may have degraded over the years. But I don't have any particular ideas about judicial education. You know, you could say flippant things like, oh, everybody should take a science class. Everybody should take a math class. You know, the old joke you've mentioned, right? If we could do math, we would have been in medical school. So we're self-selected out of that. And I don't think much of that would do any good, frankly. I think the efforts like Francis has done on these outreach, and I've been part of that too, was good. And judges are really excited about this stuff, and they're a little less excited when they learn about the limitations, and that always gives me pause. But they're eager to learn, and I think it's really been helpful. So those kind of outreach things, I think, would be very, very valuable and have been.
What about this is kind of a leading question and maybe one of our last questions that I'll draw in the audience members' question as well. What about a psychology class? Because isn't the law fundamentally about human behavior in lots of different ways? And the question on the table here is, do you have any insight on concrete steps judges, other dispute resolution professionals can take to lead people to feel that they've been heard and received fair process? And to me, that's a psychology question. How much of this is the human behavior, and how much of this do we need to understand or know the mechanisms? And I recognize that this is a big question, right? That is explicitly not in your book, but it might be a nice place for us to get your thoughts as we wrap up.
I'll just go brief. Sorry, Francis, were you going to say something?
No, go ahead. I'll join after you.
I was just going to say briefly that I think we take pains to identify the scope that's in bounds for neuroscience and the scope that maybe is to avoid the scope that's in bounds for, say, behavioral science. And the question, you're absolutely right, Emily, as a memory scientist, one of the issues that the law wrestles with is sort of what's the relationship between, one's confidence in your memory and the accuracy of your memory. And I was on a National Academy of Sciences committee to take up this very question and try to optimize sort of eyewitness identification practices and the entering of procedures for handling the entering of eyewitness testimony in the courts. And really, there's been, strong, significant progress over the last decade or so in understanding why it is the case that from the fundamental workings of our minds, memory accuracy and memory confidence are strongly correlated. But by the time a witness is in the, testifying in the court, there's a decorrelation often between confidence and accuracy. And that's a behavioral science, a psychological question. And that has to do with the ways in which memory gets corrupted by all the other retellings of that initial identification, et cetera. And suddenly an eyewitness who was not confident, or maybe didn't even pick out the suspect in the initial lineup, is now 100% certain that they will never forget that face, that person. And they won't forget that person, but it's not because they're drawing on their memory from the initial experience. They're drawing all these intervening memories. But this is just to say that there are clear problems that the law faces where, the rich literature on behavioral science, psychological science, and other disciplines really are it's the right literature, the right experts to bring in. And then there are other problems where I believe the neuroscience data can be helpful.
If I could, I think we're at time. I would just say, one, answer the question, no, we didn't reach that for the reasons that Anthony just mentioned. And I would just say that I think neuroscience has its greatest value where the behavioral evidence is either in dispute or simply misses entirely. And the analogy I use is cancer screening. So we do breast cancer screening and colon cancer screening because we look fine and we might feel fine, but the cells in our body are doing something that's not fine. And similarly, there are litigants who say, I am injured, and the other says, I'm not injured, that I did intend this, I didn't intend that. And so there's uncertainty from the behavior, at which point sometimes, given all the limitations we've just discussed, the neuroscience might be able to help a judge or jury adjudicate.
I see that we're at time. I want to really thank all of our panelists, Francis, Anthony, Jeff, Owen, and Morris. I want to thank the Berkeley Judicial Institute, and I want to thank our audience, especially for the really thoughtful questions. The book is just over 100 pages. It is brief, it is very slim, and it can be a resource to other resources. And I don't know if Denise or anyone else from the Berkeley Judicial Institute wants to wrap us up, but thank you.
I want to say on that long list of people we appropriately thanked, I believe we forgot to thank Professor Emily Murphy, our moderator. Moderating, when it's beautifully done, looks like not such a hard thing, but it's a hard thing, and you did such a great job. So grateful to all of you. I will say rarely does our chat demand, show me more studies. That's a compliment to all of you. I'm very grateful. And sort of on the issue of education, I think if I got to pick one word to aspire to as a judge, being curious is my word. And books like this help those who are curious to do a good job, do that good job better. So thanks to all of you for your time today. We're really grateful. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.